Welcome back to this ongoing series on the history of British literature, where we are opening a new chapter with a series of videos, and this new chapter is basically bracketed by the 17th century, whereas before that we spoke about something we call early modern literary history, and saw how that is something that comes out of the Middle Ages. We also saw that this period ended in the beginning of the 17th century in different ways, particularly when we're looking at the stage with the start of the Civil War in England, and then the closure of the theaters. And it's going to take a while for the really new developments, really interesting new developments in narrative prose to develop. We're going to look at that mostly in the 18th century. And the theaters will remain closed for a while until 1660. We'll come to that. But one thing, and also I stressed that a lot of the writing in this first half of the 17th century is non-fictional, is political or religious in its nature, pamphlets and other texts that are written from the various factions that are involved in the Civil War at the time. So this is not something that we're going to look into in detail, but one genre that continued to be written and that continued to be developed is poetry. So this is what we will be looking at here in this first series, first video on the 17th century, lyrical poetry. And one thing we can say, if we want to generalize the development in poetry, is that the 17th century saw a decisive further development in the construction of the speakers of lyrical poetry. So I already tried to sketch how early modern poetry was literature where speakers would speak, and these speakers are not identical to necessarily identical to the person of the writer. And we have very much, I guess, when we think of lyrical poetry, this idea of the lyrical I, or the poet talking to himself, or sort of this being alone with his own subjectivity. But that is really very much a romantic concept, and that's not the way that 17th century writers would have thought about poetry, but rather what they would have looked to create is actual rhetorical situation, or we might call them dramatic situation, where you have often clearly identifiable speakers with identifiable roles that engage in communication, not necessarily in the way that you hear all of the sides speak, as we will see, but if there's usually sort of a counterpart that is spoken to, that we can imagine. It's not something, a person that we don't know anything about. Now, we saw how that played out in early modern, particularly Petrarchan poetry, with this constellation of the lover, the male, usually male lover, who speaks to this unattainable loved person, and that person is usually also silent in the poems. But what changes is that the poetry of the 17th century vastly expands on this construct. It expands, for example, by the type of person that is being addressed. So all classic Petrarchan poetry is addressed basically to the same person, the same fictionalized, idealized woman who is not really real. This is, and we already saw the questioning of that tradition in Shakespeare's Sonnet 130. Where he says, you're not talking about real persons. I want to talk about a real person. And that might be different from your conceptions that are all kind of streamlined in a sense of always using the same kind of metaphors and same images. So suddenly now any person or any communication situation was deemed possible and could be constructed in these poems. Also, the relationship between the speaker and the addressee changes, so that this idea of unattainability is no longer the norm. This sort of platonic love relationship that Petrarca symbolized, and that again was already questioned by Shakespeare with his Dark Mistress sonnets. But now we can have lovers addressing each other in a way that is much less contemplative and much more actual, also physical action. Look at this quote here from John Donne, where he says that love's not so pure and abstract as they used to say, which have no mistress but their muse. But as all else, being elemented too, love sometimes would contemplate and sometimes do. So these love relationships, as we will see, can also be transcendentalized, can also be sublimated into religious experiences, but very often what we experience here are very real situation, very often erotically charged relation between actual lovers meeting, as you can see, for example, in this excerpt from John Donne's On His Mistress Going to Bed. Off with that girdle, like heaven's zone glittering, but a far fairer world encompassing. Unpin that spangled breastplate which you wear, that the eyes of busy fools may be stopped there. Unlace yourself, for that harmonious chime tells me from you that now it is bedtime. That's a very sort of mundane situation that you would never find in a Petrarchan poem, obviously. And these rhetorical situations are not just one-sided in the sense that there's just one person speaking, but they can actually be real arguments developing, even if we don't hear the other speaker in the way that we would in a real drama, where you have different speakers following each other. The most well-known example for such an argument type of poem certainly is John Donne's The Flea, which you definitely should check out in its entirety. I'm just going to show you sort of this one of those rhetorical moves from one argument, one part of the argument to the next. So it starts out with the speakers, the male lover and the loved one being in close proximity, and then the speaker points out a flea that has just bitten the woman. It says, "Mark but this flea, and mark in this how little that which thou deniest me is." And then he builds an elaborate conceit about this idea that in the flea, the blood of the two, because it bites both of them, in the flea, the blood of the two is mingled, and that was the way that the contemporaries conceived of the sexual act. So he says, well, this is basically, it has happened already. And then we can assume that the woman starts or wants to squish the flea because he's, oh, that's disgusting. So there's stuff going on. And then he adds, "Oh, stay, 3 lives in 1 flea spare, where we almost, more than married are. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed in marriage temple is." So something has happened in between, this motion of squishing the flea, and the speakers reacting to that. So this is what I mean by really creating these little dramatic situations that are usually built on rhetoric, on persuasion, and so on. And with that, also the language of the poems change in the way that these rhetorical situations, these dramatic situations, are also marked linguistically. So the lyrical poetry is much less formal and much more situational. In a way, it's similar to the development that I tried to sketch with the monologue, that starts out like sort of a rhetorical speech given to an audience, and in the end you have something that is much more psychological, something that is much more realistic in the sense that we can actually watch someone think. So in these poems we can hear people actually speak. Just 3 examples to show you how the situational aspect is expressed in the language. This is the first line of John Donne's The Canonization. "For God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love." Right? This is for God's sake. This is an interjection. So we see this is a very a marked rhetorical situation. Or this one, I struck the board and cried, no more, I will abroad. What, shall I ever sigh and pine? So this is from a poem that's about rejecting the call to join the clergy, and say, no, I want to live my life. I don't want to follow that call. And then, of course, this is another of the sort of rhetorical situations, but in this case, it's actually God that we're talking to. This is the ending of that poem by George Herbert. But as I raved and grew more fierce and wild at every word, methought I heard one calling, child, and I replied, my lord. So yeah, we have a very clearly dramatic or rhetorical situation here. So what we can also notice here is this sort of dissolving of the boundaries between the different kinds of relationship. That was very clear-cut also in the Petrarchan tradition, where already in the original, the love relationship to Laura is an expression in the end of this spiritual love, this religious love, where the unattainability of love leads to a religious sublimation and purification. And here in this poetry, transience and ephemerality, these ideas of life and death and the shortness of life, rather are associated directly with this idea of the passing of time, and that is captured in this motto that you might have heard of, memento mori. So be aware that you will die. You might remember this the skull that was kind of hidden in this strange device in the painting of the ambassadors. That as well was, of course, a memento mori and a reminder of our mortality. But that is something that comes to the forefront here in this poetry. That is that has these constant reminders of our own mortality. Certainly one of the reasons for this is the fact that the 17th century is a violent century, is a century that has a lot of war. It has one of the major wars being fought on the British Isles, the Civil War, which of course was a strongly traumatic experience for people living in England. And if we look into Europe, we have at the same time the 30 Years' War going on. The name tells us already that this is a war that goes on for 30 years with unimaginable bloodshed, with diseases that come along with it, cruelty and violence, and all of those experiences, hunger, disease, war, of course, are constant reminders to people that we can die at any minute, and that life is short, and that we should be mindful of this fact. So here's an example of this kind of poetry, Henry King's Sic Vita, thus is life. Like to the falling of a star, or as the flight of eagles are, or like the fresh spring's gaudy hue, or silver drops of morning dew, or like a wind that chaves the flood, or bubbles which on water stood. Even such is man, whose borrowed light is straight called in, and paid tonight. The wind blows out, the bubble dies, the spring entombed in autumn lies, the dew dries up, the star is shot, the flight is past, and man forgot. So everything is transient, everything is short, and we have this cascade of images of something that is almost gone as soon as something that is beautiful, but that is almost gone as soon as it appears, and thus is life, and thus is our own life, and we should be mindful of that. Now, that doesn't necessarily lead to a rejection of all physical materiality. That's one way to react to this. Okay, so life is short, which means we should really focus and be completely focused on the afterlife, on our eternal life. And that certainly is one of the reactions to this memento mori, but it's not the only reaction to that. So instead, we can have a celebration of physical materiality, the notion that, well, life is short, so let's make the best out of it. And this is captured in this equally well-known motto of the time of Carpe diem, of seize the day, use the day as it is. And we have a lot of poems that play on this idea of, well, if time is short, then we should make the best of it. This is just one of the many examples here from Robert Herrick's To the Virgins, to make much of time from 1648. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. Old time is still a-flying, and the same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. So we see how closely the idea of the memento mori, the dying, something that is beautiful but quickly dead, is connected with this idea. Yeah, but gather the flowers nevertheless, and enjoy them while they're there. And this is also, of course, connected to this whole topic of the rhetorical seduction that we have seen earlier. We can see this in another often anthologized poem that uses exactly the structure, memento mori, but then sees the day and integrates that into the seduction rhetoric by saying, well, you know, if we had all the time in the world, I wouldn't mind waiting for you. Had we but world enough and time, this coyness, lady, your coyness in not giving in to me, were no crime. I would love you 10 years before the flood, and you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze, 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest, and so on. So yeah, I mean, if we had all the time in the world, we could do that, and I could wait. But, all right, so this is the rhetorical if-but structure. But at my back, I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. So time is trying to catch up with me. And yonder, all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. This is the eternity in which we will be dead for an eternity. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. This is the head. Then worms shall try that long preserved virginity. So, and then comes the consequence, now let us sport us while we may, and now, like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour than languish in his slow-chapped power. So we can already see in these examples how the area of sort of metaphysical, religious speculation, life and death, the afterlife, and so on, is connected to these mundane love relationships. And this is taken to the extreme in the poetry of the time, particularly in the writing of John Donne, who goes both ways. Both in using religious language, religious imagery to describe physical love, as for example in the canonization, which is the process of becoming a saint, and where you have, for example, lines like these: we die and rise the same and prove mysterious by this Louvre. This is a different type of pronunciation back then. So, but this dying and rising is, of course, in religious term, is the death and the ascension of Christ. But at the time, to die was another coded way to reference sexual climax, and of course the rising then becomes an image of the erection. So we see how directly in one line the sexual and religious love ideas are connected. So this is kind of a profanation of religious love, but it also goes the other way around when in the Holy Sonnets Donne writes religious poetry, poetry which is directed at God and directed at his experience of religiosity, but is doing so using the language and the imagery of physical love. So this is addressed to God. Yet dearly I love you, and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie, or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me. So clearly the use of language is different, it is less formalized, it is much more colloquial, and it has a much broader range in the situation that are being developed and the way that language applies to this situation. And also it is different, as we could probably already see from some of the examples, in its use of imagery. This poetry is usually connected with this idea of the conceit as a specific type of, it's not really a specific type of image so much as a specific type of use of imagery. Helen Gardner has tried to describe that as a comparison becomes a conceit when we are made to concede likeness while being strongly conscious of unlikeness. So these are usually comparison that we would have never thought of, but then now that we think about them, strangely make sense and thereby create a new sense that we hadn't developed in the first place. So this is yoking something together that seems strange but then makes sense. Just remember what I showed you earlier about this mixture of sexual and religious language. It's like, you don't usually do that, but I see how you can develop meaning out of that. So that's really what the conceit is about. And also, once you have developed that, to not just let it stand like that, but rather to go on and play that through. So okay, so if this is like that, then I can sort of make additional comparisons, and I can develop that image all the way to its extreme and see how far I can go with that. And that's something that the poets of the time really like to do, to develop these far-flung metaphors and far-flung images, and then really work them to the last and develop them to the last. Just a brief example for this from a poem that we have already encountered, John Donne's On His Mistress Going to Bed, where he continues to talk to the mistress and says, "License my roving hands, and let them go behind, before, above, between, below. Oh, my America." So here comes the comparison. You, the loved one, are my America, my newfound land. My kingdom safeliest when with one man manned. My mine of precious stones, my empery. How blessed am I in this discovering thee. So we see, okay, we have that initial comparison, and then out of that follow all of these sort of sub-comparisons as he goes on to work with this. So what was new about this type of poetry is also the range of fields from which these images could be drawn. That could be anything from metaphysics, philosophy, religion, but also the sciences and even the body itself, and all of the different sciences. We can look at one example where John Donne writes a poem basically imagining himself, either he is already on his deathbed or he's imagining himself on his deathbed. And he starts with this idea that he has become a map, whilst my physicians by their love are grown cosmographers, and I their map. So I am the map and they are the cosmographers. I am the map who lie flat on this bed, that by them may be shown that this is my southwest discovery. Per fretum febris, by these straits to die. So the idea is I'm the map, and what I'm doing, dying through fever, is identical to traveling on the map from east to west, because of course it's in the west that the sun sets, and this is sort of a symbol of the end of life. And this also alludes to this sort of search for a Southwest Passage, a way to get past the American continent. So he uses these images of discovery, of travel, of cartography, but then continues to develop something out of that. When he says, "I joy that in these straits I see my West, for though their currents yield return to none." So the currents always move in one direction. You can't stream against the current. You will die, right? It will inexorably move you towards death. "What shall my West, my death, hurt me? As West and East in all flat maps," right? Remember, this was the original idea. I am one, are one. So death doth touch the resurrection. So obviously, if you have a map that is flat, that's just a projection of something that really is round, because it's a projection of a globe. So if what you need to do is you need to take the map and then fold it in such a way that obviously the extremes of east and west on the map actually touch themselves. And that is his connection to the idea of the resurrection. What shall my death trouble me if death, the end of life, just means the beginning of eternal life and the resurrection? So we see how all of these different areas are, in a relatively short space, are combined to create new meaning. So the type of poetry that we encounter here has often been, in retrospect, been called metaphysical poetry, although we need to be aware that it was never used by the writers themselves. It was actually first introduced in the 18th century, roughly 100 years later, as a rather derogatory term to say these were these writers who used these strange metaphysical concepts and used them in their poetry. The 18th century opposition against this kind of poetry can be seen as an indication of what they signified for the development of poetry. The 18th century, as we will see, is very much about clearness of meaning, straightforwardness, common senseness, and so on. So here, in contrast, what we have is a celebration of ambiguity, of gathering several meanings into one idea, but also new experiments on the expressive potential of form, even of pure form. One thing we find in this time of poetry is experiments with the physical form of words on the page. So here you can see George Herbert's poem Easter Wings, which is about a religious experience, but more importantly, you can see that it has sort of a strange, peculiar form with these very short lines, and the length and the shortness of the lines correspond to the meaning of sort of a spiritual contraction and expansion that has something to do with the experience of Easter. But more importantly is what happens when you turn it on its side. So if we can look at the way that it was actually printed in its original version, and here you can see that it's actually printed on the side, and then of course these lines actually form the physical, the visual impression of a pair of wings. So we see these experimentations with pure form in this kind of poetry. Out of the many poets who wrote at the time, I just want to single out one, certainly the most well-known and important, John Donne, mainly as a way to show how religious affiliation could really determine one's life and also one's writing career in many ways. So this is the young Donne, and he was born into Catholicism, into the precarious world of English Catholicism, which was a difficult confession to have at the time. His mother, Elizabeth Donne, was a lifelong Catholic, and she was actually the great niece of Sir Thomas More, so the writer of Utopia, the man who was executed by Henry VIII for his faith and who then became a martyred saint. So we see how that there is this connection. His uncle headed an underground Jesuit mission in England, was then caught, imprisoned, and exiled. His younger brother actually caught the plague in a prison where he was in for harboring a priest. So we see the family really is very strongly connected that. So Donne, as a Catholic, was unable to get a degree from universities. Catholics were barred from entering university, so that was something that he couldn't do. And then he actually, as a young man, he ruined his career further through a secret marriage to the daughter of his patron, basically, in 1601, to a wife that actually bore him 12 living and 2 stillborn children in the course of their marriage. So he's constantly in financial trouble and dependent on patronage. And he sought favor with James by turning away from his religion and by starting to write actually anti-Catholic polemics. But that wasn't enough for James. So James actually urged him to convert to Anglicanism and to take holy orders, so to become an Anglican, and this is what he did. And in 1615, he takes holy orders and he becomes a member of the Anglican Church. Then in 1621, he's actually made dean of St. Paul's, and then writes a substantial amount of sermons and also religious poetry. And this is his death mask, an image that he had made before he was dead. So he had the painter imagine himself on his deathbed already being dead. So we see that the idea of memento mori was really very much on people's minds. And that this biography also determines his works in a way, in that we can distinguish his works into the main categories: the love poetry, the religious poetry, and then the sermons who are written in prose. The love poetry was mainly written in his early years, leading up to and shortly after his secret marriage. And that was part of establishing himself in a polite court society. So that was his attempt to gain a name in polite society. And then the turn to religious verse roughly accompanies his occupation with finding the true religion and his eventual conversion to Anglicanism. And then, of course, the sermons are products of his preaching later on in life. So we see this verging between these two factions. And just a final note here, another very well-known metaphysical 17th century poet, Andrew Marvell, was himself a Puritan. So we can read these poems also as a way of expressing their religious affiliation, and that in this time could become a matter of life and death for poets.